Marcus Chun had been driving for 3 hours through the desert backroads of Nevada when he first saw the abandoned military outpost. The sun was setting behind the rocky hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded him of sunsets he'd watched through a rifle scope years ago. Those memories always came back when he least expected them. The real estate listing had been buried deep in a government surplus website, listed simply as former military installation, remote location, as is. The price was surprisingly low, which should have been his first warning. But Marcus wasn't looking for a good investment. He was looking for a place to disappear. The outpost sat on a small hill overlooking miles of empty desert. It consisted of several concrete buildings connected by covered walkways, all painted in faded military green. A chain-link fence topped with old razor wire surrounded the compound. Those sections had fallen down over the years. Guard towers stood at each corner, their windows dark and empty like dead eyes. Marcus pulled his pickup truck up to the main gate and got out. The silence was complete except for the wind whistling through the broken fence. He pulled out the keys the government clerk had given him and unlocked the heavy padlock. The gate creaked open with a sound that echoed across the desert. Walking through the compound felt like stepping back in time. Sand had blown into corners and covered most surfaces with a fine layer of dust. Tumbleweeds had collected against the buildings like nature was trying to reclaim the place. But the structures were solid, built to last through desert storms and whatever else the military had planned for this remote location. The main building housed what had once been a command center. Banks of empty equipment racks lined the walls, and thick cables ran between them like dead nerves. Marcus ran his fingers along the dusty surfaces, wondering what kind of operations had been run from this room. The government paperwork had been vague about the outpost's original purpose, listing it only as a communications facility. In a corner of the command center, Marcus found a metal desk with drawers that still opened and closed smoothly despite years of neglect. Inside one drawer, someone had left behind a half-empty pack of cigarettes and a lighter that still worked. In another, he found a photograph of 3 soldiers standing in front of the main building. They looked young and confident, probably unaware that their remote posting would someday be sold off to the highest bidder. Marcus pocketed the photograph and continued exploring. The barracks building contained rows of metal bunk beds, their thin mattresses long since claimed by desert mice. Personal lockers lined the walls, most standing open and empty. A few still contained forgotten items. A paperback novel with sand between its pages, a coffee mug with the logo of a unit Marcus didn't recognize, a small mirror cracked down the middle. The mess hall was the largest space in the compound. Long tables and benches were arranged in neat rows, waiting for soldiers who would never return. The kitchen was surprisingly well equipped, with commercial-grade appliances that looked like they might still work if someone got the power running. Marcus made a mental note to check the generator building next. As he walked through these empty spaces, Marcus felt a familiar weight settling on his chest. It was the same feeling he'd carried since leaving the army 2 years ago. The feeling of being disconnected from everything that had once given his life meaning. In the military, every day had a purpose. Every mission mattered. Every shot he took through his rifle scope was part of something bigger than himself. But civilian life was different, harder in ways he hadn't expected. People talked about things that seemed trivial after spending years in war zones. They complained about traffic jams and slow internet, while Marcus remembered nights spent watching for enemy movement through thermal scopes. They worried about mortgage payments while he woke up in cold sweats, reliving firefights that had ended years ago. The generator building was behind the main complex, connected by a partially buried power cable. Inside, Marcus found a massive diesel generator that looked military-grade and built to run for weeks without maintenance. There were spare parts neatly organized on metal shelving, and fuel tanks that appeared to be intact. If he could get this running, the outpost might be livable. Marcus spent the next hour exploring the perimeter of the compound. The fence needed work in several places, and the guard towers would require serious repairs to be functional again. But the bones of the place were solid. Someone had built this outpost to last, and despite years of abandonment, it still felt like it could be defended if necessary. That thought surprised him. Defended against what? This was rural Nevada, not Afghanistan. The biggest threat out here was probably getting lost in the desert. But old habits died hard, and Marcus found himself automatically noting sight lines and defensive positions as he walked. The sun was almost down when he climbed up into the northeast guard tower. The ladder was rusty but solid, and the platform at the top gave him a commanding view of the surrounding desert. Through the cracked windows, he could see for miles in every direction. Nothing but sagebrush and rocks under the darkening sky. Marcus pulled out his phone to check for signal and wasn't surprised to find none. The nearest town was 40 miles away, and even though it was just a gas station and a diner at a highway crossroads. The isolation was part of what had attracted him to this place. No neighbors meant no awkward conversations about where he'd been or what he'd done. No one asking why a decorated army sniper was living alone in the desert instead of starting a family or building a career. He climbed down from the guard tower and walked back to his truck as the first stars appeared. In the bed of the pickup, he'd packed enough supplies to last a week: food, water, camping gear, and a toolbox full of equipment he might need to get the outpost back in working condition. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Marcus set up his camping chair outside the main building and opened a can of beans for dinner. As he ate, he watched the stars come out one by one. The desert sky was incredible once full darkness fell. Without any light pollution for hundreds of miles, the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a glowing river. This was what he'd been looking for without realizing it. Not just isolation, but the kind of vast, empty silence that let a man think. Or maybe stop thinking for a while. In the city, there was always noise, traffic, sirens, voices, the constant hum of civilization pressing in from all sides. Out here, the only sounds were the wind and the distant call of a coyote somewhere in the hills. Marcus finished his dinner and checked his watch. 9:30. In his old life, he would have been getting ready for a night mission or settling in for a long watch through his rifle scope. Now, he was just another veteran trying to figure out what came next. He carried his sleeping bag into the command center and laid it out on the floor near the windows. The concrete was hard, but he'd slept on worse surfaces. Before lying down, he walked through the compound one more time, checking that the gate was secured and the perimeter was clear. More old habits that probably made no sense in the middle of nowhere, Nevada. But as Marcus settled into his sleeping bag and listened to the wind moving through the broken fence, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not happiness exactly, but the absence of the constant anxiety that had been his companion since leaving the service. For the first time in 2 years, he fell asleep quickly and slept through the night without nightmares. He woke before dawn, as he always did, and climbed up to the guard tower to watch the sunrise. The desert was transformed in the early morning light, painted in soft purples and golds that shifted and changed as the sun climbed higher. Marcus understood why the military had chosen this location. It was beautiful in its emptiness, and the visibility was perfect for miles in every direction. After breakfast, he spent the morning working on the generator. The engine turned over on the third try, coughing black smoke before settling into a steady rumble. One by one, lights came on throughout the compound as the electrical system came back to life. The refrigerator in the mess hall hummed to life, and ventilation fans began moving stale air through the buildings. Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction as he watched the outpost come back to life. This was work he understood, mechanical problems with clear solutions. Not like the complicated mess of civilian life, where everything was gray areas and social expectations he didn't know how to navigate. By noon, he had water running from the well pump and had identified which systems needed the most work. The radio equipment was beyond repair, but the basic infrastructure was sound. He could make this place livable with time and effort. As he worked, Marcus found himself talking to the empty buildings. explaining what he was doing, commenting on the engineering choices the original builders had made. It felt good to speak out loud, even if no one was listening. In the city, talking to yourself was a sign of mental illness. Out here, it was just a conversation with the desert. The afternoon was spent repairing the fence around the compound. It was slow, hot work, but Marcus found it oddly satisfying. Each section he fixed made the outpost a little more secure, a little more like a real home. As he worked, he began to imagine what life might be like here. Growing a small garden behind the mess hall, setting up a workshop in one of the unused buildings, maybe even getting some livestock if he could figure out a reliable water source. For the first time since leaving the army, Marcus was making plans that extended beyond just getting through another day. The outpost was giving him something he hadn't realized he needed, a mission. Not the life-or-death missions of his military service, but something smaller and more personal. The mission of bringing this forgotten place back to life. As the sun set on his first full day at the outpost, Marcus climbed back up to the guard tower with a cup of coffee and the photograph he'd found in the desk. He studied the faces of the 3 young soldiers, wondering where they were now. Probably living normal lives in suburbs somewhere, with families and mortgages and all the complications of civilian existence. Marcus had tried that life briefly after leaving the army. A small apartment in Phoenix, a job at a security company, attempts at dating that never seemed to go anywhere. Everyone said he should be grateful to be alive, and whole when so many of his brothers in arms had come home broken or not at all. And he was grateful. But gratitude wasn't the same as happiness, and normal wasn't the same as right. The outpost felt right in a way nothing had since he'd turned in his rifle and walked away from the only life he'd ever really known. It was a place where his skills mattered, where the habits and instincts that made him a good soldier weren't liabilities to be overcome, but advantages to be embraced. Marcus spent another hour in the guard tower, watching the desert turn purple in the twilight. Tomorrow he would drive to the nearest town for supplies. Real supplies this time, tools and materials to make the outpost not just livable, but comfortable. He was already making a mental list of everything he would need. For the first time in 2 years, Marcus Chun was looking forward to tomorrow. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus first arrived at the outpost, and the place was beginning to feel like home. He'd made 4 trips to town for supplies, each time loading his truck with everything from solar panels to canned goods. The locals at the hardware store had stopped asking questions about his project, though he could see the curiosity in their eyes when he bought industrial-grade security equipment alongside ordinary household items. The compound was transformed. The fence was completely repaired and reinforced in key sections. The guard towers now had new glass in their windows and functioning lights. Marcus had installed motion sensors at strategic points around the perimeter, connected to a simple alarm system he'd rigged up in the command center. It wasn't paranoia, he told himself. It was just good sense when living alone in such a remote location. The living quarters he'd set up in the former communications room were Spartan, but comfortable. A military surplus cot, a small table and chair, and shelf for his few possessions. He'd hung the photograph of the 3 unknown soldiers on the wall, along with a map of the surrounding area marked with hiking trails and water sources he'd discovered during his daily reconnaissance walks. Marcus had fallen into a routine that felt natural after years of military discipline. Up before dawn, coffee, and a quick inspection of the perimeter. Morning exercises in the compound yard, push-ups, sit-ups, and running laps around the inside of the fence. Breakfast, followed by work on various improvement projects. Lunch at noon exactly. Afternoon patrol of the wider area around the outpost. Evening meal, equipment maintenance, and planning for the next day's tasks. It was during one of these afternoon patrols that Marcus first noticed he wasn't alone in the desert. He was about 2 miles south of the outpost, following a dry creek bed that wound between low hills, when something made him stop. Not a sound exactly, but the absence of sound. The desert had its own rhythm of small noises, whined through sagebrush, the scurry of lizards over rocks, the distant cry of hawks circling overhead. But suddenly, everything was quiet. Marcus dropped to one knee and scanned the terrain ahead through his binoculars. Nothing moved in the brush. No dust clouds on the horizon. But his instincts, honed by years of staying alive in hostile territory, told him something was wrong. He'd learned to trust those instincts. Moving carefully from cover to cover, Marcus worked his way up the side of the nearest hill until he had a commanding view of the creek bed below. There, partially hidden by a large boulder, was a small camp. No fire, no movement, but definitely human presence. 2 sleeping bags, a pile of equipment covered by camouflage netting, and, most concerning, what looked like observation equipment pointed toward his outpost. Marcus spent 20 minutes watching the camp through his binoculars before he saw movement. 2 men in civilian clothes, but moving with military precision. One was Asian, probably in his 40s, with the lean build of someone who stayed in fighting shape. The other was younger and broader, with close-crop hair and the kind of alertness that came from recent combat experience. They weren't hikers or hunters. Everything about their equipment and behavior suggested surveillance. Professional surveillance. The kind that meant Marcus's peaceful retirement in the desert was about to become complicated. He watched for another hour, noting details. The men were definitely watching the outpost. They had high-powered binoculars and what looked like a spotting scope. They moved in shifts, one always on watch while the other rested. Their camp was well concealed and positioned with excellent sight lines. These weren't amateurs. Marcus made his way back to the outpost by a circuitous route, staying in the low ground and using every piece of cover the terrain offered. His mind was racing with possibilities. Had his purchase of the outpost triggered some kind of investigation? Was there something about this place he didn't know? Or was this about his past finally catching up with him? Back at the compound, Marcus went immediately to the command center and started going through every piece of paperwork he'd received when he bought the property. The government forms were mostly routine, but now he read them with the eye of someone who understood how bureaucracies worked. Most of the outpost's history was classified or redacted, but there were hints. References to specialized communications equipment and sensitive operations. As the sun set, Marcus climbed to the northeast guard tower and used his own binoculars to scan the hills where he'd spotted the surveillance camp. He couldn't see the men from this distance, but he knew they were there, watching, waiting for something. That night, Marcus didn't sleep. Instead, he sat in the darkened command center with his rifle across his lap, watching the perimeter monitors he'd installed. The motion sensor stayed quiet, but that didn't mean much. Professional operators knew how to move without triggering basic security systems. Around 3 in the morning, Marcus made a decision. He couldn't just sit here wondering what these men wanted. He needed information, and that meant taking the initiative. Before dawn, Marcus slipped out of the compound through a section of fence he'd modified for exactly this purpose. He learned in Afghanistan that sometimes the best defense was going on the offensive, and 20 years of military training didn't just disappear because you bought a piece of desert real estate. Moving through the pre-dawn darkness, Marcus worked his way toward the surveillance camp using every stealth technique he'd learned as a sniper. Stay low, move slowly, use shadows and terrain to break up your silhouette. Stop frequently to listen. Trust your instincts about when something doesn't feel right. The camp was exactly where he'd seen it the day before, but now Marcus could get close enough to really study it. The equipment was expensive and sophisticated. Military-grade night vision, encrypted radios, digital cameras with telephoto lenses. This wasn't random surveillance. Someone with serious resources was very interested in his outpost. Marcus settled into a concealed position about 50 yards from the camp and waited. As the eastern sky began to lighten, he heard voices. Low conversation in what sounded like a mixture of English and Spanish. The men were discussing schedules, talking about shift changes and check-in times with someone they called Control. One phrase made Marcus's blood run cold. The target is definitely alone, and he's military. Probably special operations based on how he moves and the way he's secure the compound. Target. They weren't just watching the outpost. They were watching him specifically. As full daylight arrived, Marcus got his first clear look at the men's faces through his rifle scope. The younger one looked familiar in a way that made his stomach tighten. Not someone he'd served with, but someone he'd seen before. In photographs, in briefings, in the kind of classified files that came across his desk when he was doing the kind of work that officially never happened. The older man was Carlos Reyes, former Colombian military, later worked as a contractor for various intelligence agencies. The younger one was David Park, ex-Army Rangers, dishonorably discharged for reasons that were probably classified. Both men had reputations in the shadow world of private military contractors and black operations, and both had very good reasons to want Marcus Chin dead. The pieces started falling into place with sickening clarity. 3 years ago, Marcus had been part of a classified operation in Central America, a drug lord with connections to terrorist networks, a compound in the jungle that officially didn't exist, a shot from 800 meters that ended a threat to American interests and probably saved dozens of lives. But operations like that created ripple effects. People who wanted revenge, people who held grudges, and sometimes those people had enough money to hire professionals like Reyes and Park to settle old scores. Marcus watched the surveillance camp for another hour, gathering intelligence on their equipment, their habits, their communication procedures. They were professionals, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed he was just another veteran playing soldier in the desert, not someone who still remembered how to fight a real war. By mid-morning, Marcus was back at the outpost, but everything had changed. This wasn't his peaceful retirement anymore. It was a tactical situation, and he needed to treat it like one. The first priority was intelligence. Marcus spent the day reviewing everything he knew about Reyes and Park, pulling details from memory that he'd rather have forgotten. Reyes was a patience hunter who liked to study his targets for days before making a move. Park was more aggressive, preferring quick strikes and overwhelming force. Together, they made a formidable team. But Marcus had advantages too. He knew this terrain intimately now after 3 weeks of daily patrols. He'd planned and built his defenses assuming he might someday need them. And most importantly, he was defending his home. That made a difference in ways that were hard to quantify, but very real. The second priority was preparation. Marcus spent the afternoon checking and rechecking every defensive system in the compound. The motion sensors, the lights, the alarm systems. He test-fired his rifle at the makeshift range he'd set up behind the generator building, confirming that his optics were properly zeroed. He inventoried his ammunition and made sure his first aid kit was fully stocked. As evening approached, Marcus climbed to the guard tower one more time. Through his binoculars, he could see smoke from a small fire at the surveillance camp. Reyes and Park were settling in for another night of watching and waiting. But Marcus was done waiting. If they wanted to finish something that started 3 years ago in a Central American jungle, he would accommodate them. But it would be on his terms, on his ground, using skills that had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments. That night, Marcus didn't sleep at all. He moved through the compound like a ghost, checking and rechecking every approach route, every sight line, every possible weakness in his defenses. The outpost felt different now. Not like a home, but like what it had originally been designed to be. A military installation built for war. Around midnight, the motion sensors picked up movement near the southern fence. Marcus was in the command center instantly, watching the displays and listening to the night. But it was just a coyote, probably drawn by the smell of food from the mess hall. The animal wandered through the compound for a few minutes before disappearing back into the desert. But the intrusion reminded Marcus of something important. He wasn't the only one who knew this terrain. Reyes and Park had been watching for days now. They'd seen his routines, his habits, his defensive preparations. If they were planning to move against him, they would already know everything he thought were his advantages. As dawn approached, Marcus made another decision. He couldn't just wait for them to come to him. Passive defense was how you got killed when facing multiple experienced opponents. He needed to take the initiative to force them to react instead of letting them control the pace of events. The morning sun was just touching the eastern mountains when Marcus slipped out of the compound again. But this time, he wasn't going to just observe. It was time to send Reyes and Park a message. Time to let them know that the quiet veteran living alone in the desert wasn't going to be an easy target. Time to remind them that some skills, once learned, are never really forgotten. Marcus moved through the pre-dawn darkness like a shadow, every step calculated and silent. He'd painted his face with mud and charcoal, and his desert camouflage uniform blended perfectly with the rocky terrain. In his hands, he carried his old friend, the modified M24 sniper rifle that had served him faithfully through 3 deployments. He'd thought he was done with this weapon, but some tools were too valuable to abandon completely. The surveillance camp lay 2 miles ahead, nestled in the dry creek bed between 2 low hills. Marcus had spent hours studying the terrain, planning his approach from 3 different directions. Reyes and Park were professionals, but they were watching his outpost, not expecting an attack on their position. That gave him the element of surprise, at least temporarily. Moving in short rushes from cover to cover, Marcus worked his way to within 400 meters of the camp. Through his rifle scope, he could see one figure silhouetted against the faint glow of a carefully concealed camp stove. Park was making coffee, following the kind of routine that could get you killed if someone was hunting you. But Marcus wasn't here to kill anyone. Not yet, anyway. This was about sending a message, establishing dominance, letting Reyes and Park know that their surveillance operation had been compromised. Sometimes the threat of violence was more effective than violence itself. Marcus settled into a shooting position behind a cluster of rocks that gave him a perfect view of the camp. He could see their equipment clearly now, the high-power binoculars, the radio setup, the digital cameras with telephoto lenses. Everything they needed to watch his outpost and plan their attack. Through his scope, Marcus watched Park move around the camp with military precision. The man was alert but not paranoid, confident in their concealment and the distance from the outpost. That confidence was about to be shattered. Marcus adjusted his scope for the range and wind conditions, then selected his target. Not Park himself, but the expensive spotting scope that was pointed directly at his outpost. A single shot would destroy the equipment and announce his presence without crossing the line into open warfare. The rifle felt familiar in his hands, like greeting an old friend after a long absence. Marcus controlled his breathing, found his natural point of aim, and gently squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle echoed across the desert as the spotting scope exploded in a shower of glass and metal. Park dove for cover behind the boulder, shouting for Reyes, who emerged from one of the sleeping bags with a pistol in his hand. Both men were scanning the hills, trying to locate the source of a shot, but Marcus was already moving. He'd fired from a position that gave him multiple escape routes, and he was using all of them. As he slipped away through the broken terrain, Marcus heard their voices carrying across the desert air. Angry Spanish mixed with military English, the sound of men who just realized they were no longer the hunters but the hunted. The psychological advantage had shifted, and they knew it. Back at the outpost, Marcus climbed to the guard tower and used his binoculars to watch the surveillance camp. Reyes and Park were packing quickly, abandoning their position now that it was compromised. But they weren't leaving the area. Through the scope, Marcus could see them moving to a new location further north, closer to the main road that led to his property. They were repositioning for an assault, not a retreat. The message Marcus had intended to send, "I know you're there, back off," had been received as a declaration of war. Which maybe it was. Some situations didn't have peaceful solutions. Marcus spent the rest of the morning preparing for siege. He moved supplies from the storage buildings into the command center, creating a fortified position that could sustain him for several days. Water, food, ammunition, medical supplies, communications equipment. Everything he needed to hold out until help arrived, assuming help was coming. The radio in the command center was military surplus, capable of reaching emergency frequencies monitored by law enforcement and military units. But Calling for help meant explanations, investigations, questions about why two professional killers were trying to murder a retired soldier in the Nevada desert. Some stories were too classified to tell, even to save your life. By noon, Reyes and Park had established their new position in a cluster of rocks about a mile north of the outpost. Marcus could see movement occasionally when the sun caught their equipment, but they were being more careful now. The easy surveillance phase was over. This was the preparation phase, the careful planning that preceded a direct assault. Marcus used the time to study his defensive options. The compound had been designed by military engineers who understood siege warfare. The buildings were concrete block construction, thick enough to stop rifle rounds. The walkways between buildings were covered, allowing movement without exposure to sniper fire. The guard towers provided excellent observation posts and fighting positions. But the compound also had weaknesses. The fence, while secure against casual intrusion, wouldn't stop determined attackers. The windows in the main buildings were large and unprotected. The generator was outside the main defensive perimeter, making it vulnerable to sabotage. And, most critically, Marcus was alone. Two experienced fighters could maintain pressure around the clock, but one man had to sleep eventually. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself thinking about the three soldiers in the photograph he'd found in the desk drawer. Young men who'd served at this outpost during whatever classified operations had been conducted here. Had they ever faced a situation like this? Had they ever had to defend this place against professional killers? The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd bought this outpost looking for peace, for a place to escape the violence of his past. Instead, he found himself back in familiar territory, outgunned, outnumbered, but with good defensive positions and the kind of motivation that made ordinary men do extraordinary things. Around 4 in the afternoon, Marcus's motion sensors triggered. Movement along the northern fence line, too large and too purposeful to be wildlife. Through the cameras he'd installed around the perimeter, he could see a figure in desert camouflage moving carefully through the sagebrush. Reconnaissance and force, testing his defensive systems and reaction times. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Better to let them think their approach was undetected than to reveal the full extent of his surveillance capabilities. But he tracked the intruder's movement through multiple cameras, noting the professional way the man moved, the careful attention to cover and concealment. The figure reached the fence and spent several minutes examining the wire and the gate mechanism, looking for weaknesses, planning breach points for the main assault. Then, he disappeared back into the desert, leaving behind tiny electronic devices that Marcus couldn't quite identify from his camera angles. Probably motion sensors of their own, designed to alert them when he left the compound. As evening approached, Marcus made another decision. The passive defense strategy wasn't working. Reyes and Park were too experienced to be deterred by a single warning shot, and they had all the time in the world to plan their attack. Meanwhile, Marcus was trapped in his own compound, unable to resupply or call for reinforcements without exposing himself. The solution was aggressive defense. Make them react to his moves instead of the other way around. Force them to fight on his terms, when and where he chose. It was risky, but passive defense against multiple experienced attackers was just slow suicide. That night, Marcus waited until full darkness before moving. He'd spent the afternoon studying satellite images of the surrounding terrain on his laptop, identifying every possible approach route, every piece of cover, every tactical advantage. The desert looked empty, but to someone who understood military operations, it was full of opportunities. He slipped out of the compound through his concealed exit and began moving toward the new surveillance position. But instead of approaching directly, Marcus took a wide detour that would bring him up behind Reyes and Park's probable location. If they were watching his compound, and they certainly were, they wouldn't be watching their back trail as carefully. The night movement brought back memories Marcus had tried to bury. Patrols through hostile territory, where every shadow might hide an enemy, and every sound might be your last. The weight of equipment, the controlled breathing, the constant calculation of distance and angles and escape routes. It was terrifying and exhilarating and strangely comforting all at once. 3 hours after leaving the outpost, Marcus was in position on a ridge overlooking the area where he'd seen movement during the afternoon. Below him, partially concealed among a cluster of boulders, he could see the faint heat signature of their camp through his night vision scope. Two figures, one on watch while the other rested. Professional discipline, but predictable patterns. Marcus spent an hour observing their routine. Guard change every 2 hours. The man on duty focused primarily on the outpost to the south, occasionally scanning other directions, but not with the same intensity. Their equipment was arranged for quick departure, but also for sustained operations. They were prepared for a siege that might last several days. But they made one crucial mistake. Their position, while excellent for observing the outpost, was vulnerable to attack from the higher ground to the north. The military principle of always holding the high ground was apparently one they'd forgotten or never learned properly in the first place. Marcus lined up his shot carefully, not at either of the men. That would escalate this into open warfare and probably get him killed. Instead, he aimed at their radio equipment, the encrypted set they were using to communicate with whoever had hired them. Cut their communications, and they became isolated and much less dangerous. The shot was clean and quiet, the suppressed rifle barely making more noise than a cough. 800 meters away, the radio exploded in a shower of sparks and plastic fragments. Both men dove for cover, but this time they knew approximately where the shot had come from. Marcus was already moving, using the terrain to mask his retreat while they tried to organize a response. Behind him, he could hear shouted commands in Spanish and English, sounds of equipment being packed quickly. The psychological war was working. Each successful attack made them more paranoid, more cautious, more focused on their own security instead of planning their assault on the outpost. But it also made them more dangerous. Corner professionals were unpredictable, and Marcus had probably pushed them past the point where they might consider backing down. The next phase would be direct confrontation, and he needed to be ready for that. Back at the outpost, Marcus climbed to the guard tower and used his night vision equipment to scan the desert. Somewhere out there, two very angry and very skilled killers were regrouping and planning their next move. They'd lost their observation equipment and their communications, but they still had weapons, training, and a contract to fulfill. As dawn approached, Marcus realized this was probably his last quiet morning at the outpost. The games were over. The psychological warfare had served its purpose, but now came the real test. When Reyes and Park finally made their move, it would be decisive. No more surveillance, no more probing attacks. They would come with everything they had, and only one side would walk away. Marcus checked his weapons one more time, verified his ammunition count, and made sure his first aid kit was easily accessible. Then, he settled in to wait for the storm he knew was coming. In the growing light of dawn, the desert looked peaceful and empty. But appearances could be deceiving, and Marcus knew that somewhere beyond the horizon, death was making its final preparations. The attack came at dawn, just as Marcus had expected. He was in the northeast guard tower, scanning the perimeter through his rifle scope, when the first explosion rocked the compound. The generator building erupted in flames and smoke, cutting power to half the security systems. Reyes and Park weren't playing games anymore. Marcus rolled away from the tower windows as rifle rounds cracked past his head, splinters of concrete flying from the impact points. Two shooters, firing from different positions, using the explosion as cover to get within effective range. Professional tactics, executed with military precision. Through the smoke and chaos, Marcus could see muzzle flashes from two locations, one near the northern fence line, another from the cluster of rocks where they'd established their new surveillance post. They had him in a crossfire, pinning him down while they maneuvered for better positions. Marcus low-crawled across the tower platform to the opposite side, using the concrete walls for protection. His rifle was equipped with a high-powered scope, giving him an advantage at distance. But close-range firefights were won by volume of fire and tactical movement. 2 against 1 was bad odds, even for a former sniper. A second explosion shook the compound as something, probably a grenade, detonated near the mess hall. They were trying to drive him out of the guard tower, force him into the open where they could finish this quickly. But Marcus had spent 3 weeks learning every inch of this compound, and he knew things about its defensive capabilities that weren't obvious from the outside. He keyed the radio on his belt, activating a system he'd hoped never to use. Throughout the compound, speakers hidden in the buildings came to life with the sound of gunfire and shouting voices. Recordings he'd made during his military service, designed to confuse attackers about how many defenders were actually present. Psychological warfare on a small scale, but every advantage mattered when you were outnumbered. The recorded firefight echoed across the desert, mixing with the real sounds of battle to create total chaos. Through his scope, Marcus could see Reyes hesitate near the fence line, clearly confused by the apparent number of defenders. The disinformation was working, but it wouldn't fool them for long. Marcus lined up his first shot carefully. Reyes was partially concealed behind a fence post, but enough of his torso was visible for a clean kill. 800 meters, slight crosswind. Target moving slowly from right to left. All factors Marcus had calculated 1,000 times before in much more stressful situations. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, and Reyes spun and fell behind the fence line. Hit, but Marcus couldn't tell how badly. Through the scope, he could see blood on the ground, but wounded men were often more dangerous than healthy ones. Pain and adrenaline could make a professional soldier incredibly hard to stop. Rifle rounds slammed into the guard tower around Marcus as Park returned fire from his position near the rocks. The younger man was using a semi-automatic rifle with a high-capacity magazine, spraying bullets in Marcus's general direction while he moved to a better position. Suppressive fire designed to keep Marcus's head down while Park maneuvered for a killing shot. But Marcus had fought in places where this kind of firefight was an everyday occurrence. He knew that the key to surviving overwhelming firepower was patience, discipline, and superior marksmanship. Let the enemy waste ammunition while you waited for the perfect shot. Marcus shifted position again, moving to the southern wall of the tower where he had a different angle on Park's location. Through the scope, he could see the younger man darting between pieces of cover, trying to get close enough to the compound for an effective assault. But Marcus had planned for this scenario during his weeks of preparation. Concealed throughout the compound were claymore mines he'd acquired through contacts who didn't ask too many questions. Not enough to stop a determined assault, but enough to channel attackers into predetermined killing zones. As Park approached the fence line, Marcus triggered the first mine with a remote detonator. The explosion lit up the pre-dawn darkness and sent Park diving for cover behind a concrete drainage culvert. Shrapnel scars appeared in the ground around his position, and Marcus could see the younger man favoring his left leg as he moved. Wounded but still in the fight. The recorded gunfire from the speakers was beginning to fade as the audio loops reached their end. Soon Reyes and Park would realize they were fighting one man, not a squad of defenders. Marcus needed to end this before they regrouped and coordinated their final assault. He climbed down from the guard tower and moved through the covered walkways toward the command center. The compound was designed for exactly this kind of fighting, with protected movement routes between defensive positions. But it also meant he was temporarily blind to what his attackers were doing. In the command center, Marcus activated the few security cameras that were still functioning. The explosion had damaged the main power supply, but backup batteries kept essential systems running. On the monitors, he could see smoke rising from the generator building and scorch marks around the fence line where the claymore had detonated. But no sign of Reyes or Park. That was bad. Invisible enemies were always more dangerous than visible ones, especially when they were wounded and angry. Marcus needed to regain visual contact before they got inside the compound's defensive perimeter. He grabbed extra ammunition and medical supplies from his emergency kit, then moved toward the mess hall, where he had another defensive position prepared. The large windows gave him excellent fields of fire in multiple directions, and the concrete walls would stop anything short of armor-piercing rounds. As Marcus reached the mess hall, movement outside caught his eye. Park was limping along the southern fence line, using the early morning shadows for concealment. He was carrying what looked like explosive charges, probably planning to breach the fence and assault the main buildings. But where was Reyes? The answer came in the form of rifle fire from an unexpected direction. Rounds smashed through the mess hall windows, forcing Marcus to dive for cover behind the commercial-grade kitchen equipment. Reyes had circled around to the west, using the confusion of battle to get into a flanking position. The older man was hurt, but far from out of the fight. Marcus found himself caught between two experienced killers who were coordinating their assault despite their communications being destroyed. They were using hand signals and fire and movement tactics that spoke of extensive combat experience. This wasn't going to be won by superior marksmanship alone. The sound of explosions echoed across the compound as Park blew holes in the fence at two different locations. Multiple breach points meant Marcus couldn't cover all the approaches. They were going to get inside the perimeter, and when they did, this would become a close-quarters battle where their numerical advantage would be decisive. Marcus made a tactical decision that went against every instinct he'd developed during 20 years of military service. Instead of staying in his prepared defensive positions, he was going to take the fight to them. Attack when they expected him to defend. Move when they expected him to hide. He slipped out of the mess hall through a rear door and began moving toward the fence line where Park had blown his breaches. The younger man would be coming through those openings, probably within the next few minutes. If Marcus could catch him in the open ground between the fence and the buildings, he might be able to even the odds. The compound was eerily quiet as Marcus moved through the early morning shadows. The recorded gunfire had stopped completely, and even the wind seemed to have died down. It was the kind of silence that preceded sudden, explosive violence. Marcus reached the first breach point just as Park came through the gap in the fence. The two men saw each other at the same instant, rifles coming up in a deadly race to see who could aim and fire first. But Marcus had the advantage of surprise and 20 years of experience in exactly this kind of situation. His shot took Park's center mass, spinning the younger man around and dropping him to the ground beside the fence. But Park wasn't done. Even wounded, he managed to get his rifle up and return fire, forcing Marcus to roll behind a concrete barrier as bullets cracked over his head. The firefight that followed was brief, but intense. Two professionals, both wounded, both determined to survive, trading shots at close range across 20 yards of open ground. Marcus had better cover, but Park had a semi-automatic weapon that could put out a lot of rounds quickly. It ended when Park's rifle ran empty, and he reached for a fresh magazine. Marcus put 2 rounds into the younger man's chest, ending the threat permanently. One down, one to go. But where was Reyes? The answer came as Marcus was moving toward Park's body to secure his weapons. A rifle shot from the direction of the command center sent concrete chips flying from the ground near his feet. Reyes had gotten inside the compound while Marcus was dealing with Park, and now he had the high ground advantage. Marcus found himself pinned down in the open, with very little cover between his position and the buildings where Reyes was located. The older killer was being patient, waiting for Marcus to make a mistake or to try to move to better cover. It was a sniper's duel now, and Reyes had positioned himself well. But Marcus knew something Reyes didn't. During his weeks of preparing the compound, he'd installed more than just security cameras and motion sensors. Hidden throughout the buildings were small explosive charges, designed to deny the compound to attacking forces if it couldn't be held. It was a last resort option, but this situation qualified. Marcus pulled out a small remote detonator and selected the charges in the command center where Reyes was positioned. It would destroy most of his equipment and supplies, but it might also end this fight decisively. The explosion was tremendous, much larger than Marcus had expected. Windows blew out throughout the compound, and a column of smoke and debris rose into the morning sky. In the sudden silence that followed, Marcus could hear nothing but the ringing in his ears and the crackle of flames. He waited 5 minutes before moving toward the ruins of the command center. Reyes was there, trapped under a collapsed section of concrete roof, obviously dead. The fight was over, but so was Marcus's refuge in the desert. As Marcus surveyed the damage to his compound, he realized that this had never really been about Reyes and Park, or even about the classified operation 3 years ago that had started this chain of events. It had been about whether he could ever truly leave the warrior behind and find peace. The answer was lying in the smoking ruins around him. Some men were built for war, and peace was just the interval between battles. Marcus had tried to convince himself that he wanted a quiet retirement in the desert, but part of him had been preparing for this fight from the moment he'd first seen the outpost. He was checking Park's body for identification when he heard the distant sound of helicopters. Multiple aircraft approaching fast from the north. Marcus looked up to see 4 military helicopters in formation, flying low and direct toward his position. Someone had been monitoring the situation, after all. The explosions and gunfire had probably been visible from satellites, and isolated firefights in the Nevada desert were the kind of thing that attracted official attention very quickly, especially when they involved former special operations soldiers and classified military installations. Marcus set down his rifle and raised his hands as the helicopters circled the compound. He recognized the aircraft markings. They were from a unit that officially didn't exist, the kind of organization that handled problems too sensitive for conventional law enforcement. As the helicopters landed and tactical teams poured out, Marcus felt oddly relieved. The isolation he'd sought in the desert had been an illusion anyway. You couldn't run from what you were, and Marcus Chun was a warrior. He'd always been a warrior, and apparently he always would be. The team leader who approached him was a Colonel Marcus recognized from his time in special operations. An old friend, or at least someone who understood the complex world of classified missions and their long-term consequences. Marcus, the colonel said, holstering his sidearm as he surveyed the battlefield. We've been looking for you for 3 days. Someone leaked classified information about the Central American operation, and we needed to bring you in before the situation got worse. It already got worse, Marcus replied, gesturing toward the bodies of Reyes and Park. But it's handled now. The colonel nodded, studying the tactical situation with professional interest. Clean work. Very clean. We could use someone with your skills for a new operation. Something that requires a special touch. Marcus looked around at the compound he'd tried to turn into a home. The guard towers he'd repaired, the fence he'd rebuilt, the buildings he'd restored. All of it damaged or destroyed in a battle he'd never wanted to fight, but had been inevitable from the moment he'd tried to walk away from his past. What kind of operation? Marcus asked, already knowing he would accept whatever they offered. The outpost had taught him something important about himself. He wasn't meant for peace. He was meant for missions that mattered, for battles that needed to be won, for work that kept dangerous people from hurting innocent ones. The colonel smiled, recognizing the acceptance in Marcus's voice. The kind that requires a former sniper who knows how to defend remote installations. We have some assets in hostile territory that need protecting. As the helicopters lifted off with Marcus aboard, he looked down at the smoking ruins of his brief attempt at civilian life. It had been a good fight, and he'd won it. But more importantly, he learned something about himself that no amount of peaceful desert mornings could have taught him. Some men were born for war, and Marcus Chun was one of them. The desert would keep its secrets, and Marcus would go back to keeping his country's.